In a recent commentary, I touched upon the idea, popular among many on the right, that John F. Kennedy was actually a conservative. This is utter nonsense. PragerU has a video going over this idea, and similar to the notion itself, it is quite nonsensical. So let's cover it real quick. The video is presented by Larry Elder, who I discovered several years ago was using his website to promote a book called The Dark Side of Camelot, which is incredibly critical of John F. Kennedy, for years after making this video. Also, and this is not all that relevant, I concede, but I figured I might as well mention it for the sake of completeness. The book in question is utter garbage. Edward J. Epstein wrote a review for it in the Los Angeles Times where he goes over several problems with the book, but essentially, any correct information that is worthwhile had already been printed in reliable sources by this point, and the rest is a series of unsubstantiated claims regarding Kennedy and his family, along with a lot of speculation about motivations that is simply baseless. The book also had to undergo some heavy rewriting shortly before its publication, after it was revealed that several documents which substantiated the author's claims related to Kennedy's alleged affair with Marilyn Monroe were simply forgeries. The conclusion in question, by the way, was not removed from the book, just the documents the author viewed as evidence.
He was one of America's most popular presidents. Handsome, charismatic, a war hero. He believed a strong military was the best guarantor of peace. He explained that cutting taxes was the best way to grow the economy. He firmly opposed racial quotas and was horrified by the idea of unrestricted abortions. Can you name him? Here's one more clue. He was not a Republican. The answer? John F. Kennedy.
I mean, it wouldn't inherently surprise me if Kennedy held some views that today would be closer to certain Republican views than anything else, given he was president several decades ago and politics changes, albeit that's a fact that PragerU denied in several of its videos from around the same time period, but that's a different topic. However, I should note, I find this sort of static thinking regarding politics to be incredibly confusing, to say the very least. I apologize if I'm not articulating this the best, but here's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's look at the idea that Kennedy advocated for tax cuts. Because advocating for a tax cut when JFK took office is quite different from advocating for a tax cut these days. For those unaware, in 1960, when JFK was elected, the lowest marginal tax rate was 20%, and the highest was 91%. Kennedy then cut these tax rates, so the lowest was 16%, and the highest was 77%, which is still higher than it has ever been since. There's a difference between advocating for across-the-board tax cuts when rates are that high versus doing so today, and PragerU refuses to take that into account. None of this is even getting into how Kennedy's tax cuts were Keynesian in nature and not supply-side, or how Republicans of the era actually opposed the idea of cutting taxes at this time because they feared it would increase the nation's deficit and with that the national debt. Something that Kennedy did not believe was even remotely a concern in this situation. Hey, what does PragerU think of the national debt, out of curiosity?
In the 1958 movie The Blob, starring a young Steve McQueen, a giant expanding mass, a blob, threatens to destroy an entire town and everyone in it. It keeps growing and growing and no one can stop it. The United States debt is like that blob. Unlike the fictional blob, it threatens to destroy more than an entire town, it threatens the entire nation. Where is Steve McQueen when you need him?
I'll be skipping the entirety of the segment regarding Kennedy's support for tax cuts because although it's not technically incorrect, again, it is incredibly misleading to act like supporting tax cuts in 1960 is the same as supporting tax cuts at any other point in history where tax rates haven't been nearly as high. This video was released in 2017 for reference, a time where the top marginal tax rate was 39.6%, less than half of the top marginal tax rate when Kennedy first took office. Also, I want to take a moment to discuss the unrestricted abortion claim, because that is bluntly just never backed up. Even ignoring the fact that unrestricted is so broad that essentially any support for a single restriction would, by definition, be an example of opposing unrestricted abortion, the video just takes Kennedy's opposition to something completely different and uses that as evidence, while also showing somebody who was notably not John F. Kennedy being critical of the idea.
On abortion, Kennedy was assassinated a decade before the landmark Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. Abortion was not a major issue during his administration, but we do know that he nominated Justice Byron White, a Democrat, to the Supreme Court. White was one of two justices who dissented in Roe v. Wade.
That doesn't mean as much as you seem to think, given presidents can commonly appoint Supreme Court justices that don't align with them ideologically for a variety of reasons. The first George Bush, for example, very famously appointed David Soter to the Supreme Court, despite the fact that Soter later became a reliable voter for the court's liberal wing.
We also know that Kennedy abhorred Japan's post-World War II use of abortion as a means of population control, saying, "On the question of limiting population, as you know, the Japanese have been doing it very vigorously through abortion, which I think would be repugnant to all Americans."
Again, you're conflating topics. Kennedy was specifically discussing the use of forced abortions for the sake of population control. It has nothing to do with unrestricted abortion access, which implies an incredibly pro-choice society. As in one where it's up to the individual if they choose to get an abortion or not. Not one where that choice is forced upon them in either direction by the government. I also want to point out real quick that the section on the PragerU website for facts and sources for this video says it has a quote from John F. Kennedy, only for the citation in question, which, by the way, is an article by the same person who presented this video, to attribute the quote to Ted Kennedy in a letter written 8 years after JFK was assassinated.
Ronald Reagan, America's 40th president, who was a Democrat much of his life, famously said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The party left me."
Yeah, and in 1960, Reagan had endorsed Nixon, and this was after he had endorsed Eisenhower in both 1952 and 1956. Reagan would go on to completely switch parties in 1962 when Kennedy was president. If any sort of party shift happened here, then for the Reagan citation to make any sense, it had to be before Kennedy.
So, if Kennedy were alive now, which party would he belong to? It's impossible to know, of course.
And yet, this entire video is trying to make the case that Kennedy would have been a member of one particular political party today. Kind of strange, to say the least.
But we can compare his political positions to those of today's Democratic Party. On race, JFK disliked the idea of using racial preferences and quotas to make up for historic racism and discrimination. Today, affirmative action is Democratic Party orthodoxy.
The phrase affirmative action was literally used in an executive order signed by Kennedy, specifically Executive Order 10925, signed on March 6, 1961, which said that government contractors have to, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. And again, you're completely conflating issues here. Affirmative action is simply an umbrella term for taking active steps to make sure equality is achieved. It can include racial quotas in theory, however, they are by no means the same thing.
On foreign policy, Kennedy was very firm about his red lines. When the Soviet Union built missile sites in Cuba, leading to what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy threatened a decisive military response. The Soviet Union backed down.
Adam Ruins Everything covered why this is a nonsensical interpretation of the Cuban Missile Crisis better than I ever could, but essentially, that's not what happened. The event in question ended because the United States pulled its missiles out of Turkey, which is what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place, as it's what inspired the Soviets to put their missiles into Cuba.
In his inaugural address, Kennedy made the case for a strong U.S. military. He saw this as the only way to deter America's enemies. Only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt, he said, can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed.
The very next words out of Kennedy's mouth were, "But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war. So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring the absolute power to destroy other nations under the absolute control of all nations. Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths, and encourage the arts and commerce. Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And if a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved. Kennedy is clearly saying that he is willing to defeat our enemies by befriending them, and that he dislikes the idea of using weapons as anything except a last resort. Although he is going to make it clear that he is willing to do such if the situation does require it. You can say a lot of things about this foreign policy, but it's far more complicated than Elder makes it out to be at the very least.
On gun rights, Kennedy was one of 8 U.S. presidents who was a lifetime member of the NRA,
which had consistently endorsed gun control legislation until the 1970s, after Kennedy was assassinated. Also, including the first George Bush on your list of lifetime NRA members is a tad misleading, given he very famously canceled his NRA membership in 1995. Anyway, my final thoughts are that if JFK were alive today, he probably wouldn't know this video exists. Good night and good luck.